Welcome back to Occult Science. This will be the last video on philosophy, but we will get straight into the science in the next video and continue it on from there. But it's very important to understand these concepts that we're going over here, so let's finish this up and talk about Carl Gustav Jung, a world-renowned psychologist, and his influence and writings on the occult. And he wrote extensively on Gnosticism, alchemy, astrology, and the concept of the sacred marriage of the sun and the moon, which is an allegory for the union of heaven and earth, or the concept of uniting pure spirit to corrupted Saturnian physical form, or what we call matter. And the figure of Baphomet from Monsieur Eliphas Lévy is the representation of this, because it is profane man or profane material creation that is dualistic, and you are uniting this divine essence to it. And this is what it looks like. It's still pretty ugly. It's trapped in a physical, corrupted, decrepit body that's going to die, but it's still the consciousness of pure spirit, the same as the concept of Prometheus, the divine spirit chained to the rock of matter. And there are tarot cards on the right which express this motif, but we will go over that after we read from Carl Jung on Christianity, pages 215 through 217. And these are all excerpts, but they are all relevant to this idea of Saturn and the demiurge. So we've talked about Zeus's exoteric role as the demiurge, and here we will talk about Saturn. And this whole chapter is on the astrology of the sign of Pisces, and he states that these astrological ideas are quite understandable when one considers that Saturn is the star of Israel, and that Jupiter means the king of justice. Among the territories ruled by the fishes, or Pisces, the house of Jupiter are Mesopotamia, Bactria, the Red Sea, and Palestine. Chiung, which is Saturn, is mentioned in Amos chapter 5, verse 26 as, quote, the star of your God. And this is Israel apostatizing and worshiping Saturn, according to Carl Jung. Continuing, he says, James of Sarug, who is a Syrian Orthodox theologian, says that the Israelites worshipped Saturn. The Sabbath is Saturday, or Saturn's day, and Albumazar, who was a Persian Islamic astrologer, testifies that Saturn is the star of Israel. In medieval astrology, Saturn was believed to be the abode of the devil, so Saturn, Satan. And he says that this was Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, and highest archon, and that they have lions' faces. So if you're familiar with Gnosticism at all, there's this concept that Sophia was this divine aeon, but she sinned in a way and didn't co-create with her divine consort Christ, and created this sort of demon spawn named Yaldabaoth, and that's in one of the more extreme versions of Gnosticism in terms of the demiurge being very, very bad. Some will have the demiurge as not being the highest god, but still serving a higher purpose, and not being good or bad per se, but some just view him as straight up shitty as hell. But either way, Yaldabaoth is considered a lion serpent, so the lion being for Leo, and the negative aspects of Leo being prideful, arrogant, egoic. And the demiurge creates out of ego, thinking he's the highest god. And then the serpent aspect of that is the negative, exoteric serpent, and the good serpent is the shining light of Lucifer, essentially. But we'll go over that with the tarot cards in a bit. Continuing, he says that Origen, who was an Alexandrian Christian theologian, elicits from the diagram of Celsus, who was an anti-Christian Greek philosopher, that Michael, the first angel of the Creator, has the shape of a lion. And Madame Blavatsky agrees with this. She says that Michael is of Jehovah, so not good in this context. Now, this always confused me about the book of Revelation, where Michael battles with the dragon, but we're not going to really worry about that here. Let's just continue with what Carl Jung says, and he states that he obviously stands in the place of Yaldabaoth, who is identical with Saturn, as Origen points out, speaking of Michael here. The demiurge of the Nassines is a fiery god, the fourth by number. And this fourth by number has to do with Kabbalah. This is the sphere of Hesed. And this is what Crowley describes as the demiurge. He's the fourth by number, and it's the lie upon lies to believe that he's the highest god. So this is the sphere of Zeus in Kabbalah. If you're not familiar with this, don't really worry about it. It's just that anthropomorphic Zeus, the demiurgic one. That's sort of code word for that. And if he, hurtles fiery lightning bolts at people, that's the spark of divinity being used in a foolish, egoic way, essentially. And we'll get into that with the tarot cards. Continuing, he says that according to the teachings of Apelles, a renowned painter of ancient Greece, there is evidently a close relationship, and also, it appears, with Yahweh, the demiurge of the Old Testament. So he's lumping all these things together with Saturn. And to differentiate real quick the difference between Saturn and Zeus, the demiurge keeps begetting himself. It's a cycle of death and rebirth. So, Saturn's the demiurge, and then Zeus takes over, and, Saturn devours his own children. So it's kind of this cycle of different creator demiurgic gods throughout time. And that's why there's all these different creation stories. And if they're anthropomorphic, then the occult probably views them as being the demiurge. Continuing, he says, Saturn is a black star, anciently reputed a malefic. This is why in astrology, Saturn and Mars are the malefic planets. And on the Kabbalah tree of life, they're both on the dark pillar, Saturn and Mars, and they're connected. Continuing, he says, dragons, serpents, and scorpions represent Saturn. He goes into a few other animals. And remarkably enough, Saturn's animals also include the ass, which on that account was rated a theriomorphic form of the Jewish god. And this is why when Christ in the New Testament rides an ass or a donkey, this is a symbolic statement of conquering sin, conquering the demiurge, conquering Yaldabaoth, the base desires of man, the material world, all these sorts of things. And the idea of Mithras slaying the bull, you'll see that sculpture at the Vatican. It's the same thing. The bull is this sensuous, earthly, representation of base desires, lusts, and man, and Mithras is this highest concealed sun god, only spirit, stabbing it in the neck, and Taurus rules the neck. And so you're slaying these base desires. You're slaying Yaldabaoth. Same thing with Christ riding the donkey, basically. Continuing, he says, similar traditions can be found in Plutarch, Diodorus, Josephus, and Tacitus, who are all historians. And Sabaoth, the seventh archon, has the form of an ass. Tertullian, who was a Christian author, is referring to these rumors when he says, you are under the delusion that our God is an ass's head, and that we do pay homage only to an ass. So basically what he's saying here is that this version of Christianity is Gnostic because they aren't worshiping the demiurge. So this Tertullian or Tertullian guy is basically talking to whoever, stating that you think that we're worshiping Jehovah, but you're wrong, because that would be worshiping an ass. You're under the delusion that we worship the demiurge. We really worship this highest God, which is essentially the idea of the occult. Christ's Father in the occult is not Jehovah. It's a higher God above him. It's the supreme being. So the highest God that Elaine Pagels was talking about, and that's why the Apostle Paul and his secret tradition, according to her, is worshiping the higher God, but that knowledge is not for the profane. The profane worship the ass's head. They worship the devil card because you can see that the devil's head is an ass. So let's continue. As we have indicated, the ass is sacred to the Egyptian Set, and in early texts, however, the ass is the attribute of the sun god, and only later became an emblem of the underworldly Apep and of the evil Set. So if it was a sun god, then most likely that was an exoteric sun god, or idolatry happened and they changed it into a dualistic god, thus reflected the consciousness of the people at the time. So you have Set, who kills Osiris, and that's the negative shadow part of all of this. And Osiris is seen in the same company as Mithras and things like that. So it's kind of like Prometheus, right? Zeus chaining Prometheus to the rock of matter, punishing him because he is giving this divine light to mankind. Osiris, you could see it as kind of the same thing. And Osiris is very important to Freemasonic philosophy, and the obelisk is one of the representations of his essence on some level. And of course, we have the obelisk in Washington, D.C. and at the Vatican, and numerous other interesting places. So let's just finish this reading up. According to medieval tradition, the religion of the Jews originated in a conjunction of Jupiter with Saturn, Islam in Jupiter conjunct Venus, Christianity in Jupiter conjunct Mercury, and the Antichrist in Jupiter conjunct the Moon. Unlike Saturn, Jupiter is a beneficent star. In the Iranian view, Jupiter signifies life, Saturn death. The conjunction of the two therefore signifies the union of extreme opposites. So again, the concept of Baphomet, uniting profane earth, profane man to the highest deity. And Albert Pike talks a lot about how there were initiated Jews that knew that Jehovah, the demiurgic Saturn, was not the highest god, but the mass of Jews worshiped the demiurge Jehovah as the highest god. So you can see how this conjunction, only the ones with eyes to see and ears to hear, and that could comprehend the light, would become the initiates, and the profane masses would just follow along with the program. So let's go to these tarot cards. Now, this is just analyzing symbolism. If you think tarot cards are evil or divination or any of that stuff, I mean, I don't care, but we're just going over the symbols on it. I'm not trying to divine spirits here or anything like that. So let's just take everything that we've read and apply it to these two cards real quick. So the devil, obviously, would have something to do with Saturn, because the black color in the background, and Saturn is a black star and a malefic. And this is a sign the direction of the north, because this is having to do with Capricorn, which is ruled by Saturn, and that is the goat, and that's the winter solstice. And the north is seen as a malign direction, especially in Freemasonry, because all of the lights of the lodge, none are in the north, according to Albert Pike. We will go over that a little later. But basically, in the northern hemisphere at least, the sun rises in the east, it's at its highest in the south, and it sets in the west, so it's not in the north. Therefore, there's no divine light in the north. Therefore, the north is a direction of darkness and ignorance. And of course, Santa Claus has to do with Saturn. It's giving you karma. You've been good or bad. He's at the North Pole, and that's a function of Saturn is karma in astrology. So all that stuff about Christmas is really based upon occult principles. And of course, you can rearrange Santa to Satan. And what happens at Christmas? You give away material presents. You get material gifts. It's all about materialism. And those are the negative aspects associated with Capricorn. So each zodiac sign has positive and negative qualities. Capricorn, it could be that you're very materialistic, only care about money. But a positive quality is that you work very hard. You're very dedicated to climbing up the ladder. That's your divine spark initiating you into things. But if you use that for material gains, material purposes, you're like the devil card, because the material realm is bad the deeper you sink into it. So if you take this divine torch like the devil has and you push it into the material, then you're really just lusting after material things. Oh, I want a fancy car, or oh, I want a good job so I can get a yacht, stuff like that. So you can see the connections here. We have a donkey face, so the ass, having to do with the Jewish god Jehovah, and he's ignorant, and he's giving the hand sign of the two pillars with the Saturn glyph in the middle, the downward pentagrams pointing down towards materialism, the atom figure, which represents the spark of divinity, is looking down at Eve's sensual fruit, and this is material lust, right? Because it's on her tail, and that's sort of like a slang. Yo, you getting some tail tonight, bro? I mean, there's so many slang things that are derived from occult principles. Like, when you called somebody a square back in the 60s or 70s, the square has to do with Earth, right? That's the square on the compass in the square, so that's the material world. So it's really crazy how all of these things have been incorporated into the world that stem from occult principles. And we read that there is a serpent quality to this and also a lion quality. And the sign of Leo, if you look at the glyph, it's like a serpent kind of figure, but a lion's mane as well. And this has something to do with the passage where the devil roams about as a lion seeking to devour, something like that. I forget what it is. It's a Peter quote. But this is essentially what this means. And if you look at the Temperance card in tarot, there's a brown lion on it. And that's supposed to be for Capricorn because this devil is brown, so earthly, right? The material. And that basically represents that. So when there's a dualistic element, the lion becomes the devil. It has a fiery, divine, regal nature, but when it lusts after material things, looking down at that tempting fruit on the female there you go. And the eagle in antiquity is related to the sign of Scorpio, and Scorpio is seen as a serpent constellation, and that's the constellation that kills Osiris, or kills the king. Ironically, John F. Kennedy was assassinated on the last day of Scorpio, and he was King Kennedy of Camelot, right? But either way, the eagle's legs there, that represents that exoteric serpent. So there you go. The devil card, the extreme picture of darkness, the worst place of materialism and man's nature that it can go. You're at your lowest when you're in line with the devil mode of consciousness. Now let's take that to the extreme opposite and look at the Lover's card, which is the card for Gemini. And you have the male and the female as a reflection of the Gemini pillars. And these are the pillars of Freemasonry, like the North and South pillars, like the North and South towers of the World Trade Center or former World Trade Center. And now they've been merged into one, the Freedom Tower. And we already spoke about the Declaration of Independence and what that represents in the occult, freedom from the demiurge. But of course, that's the secret initiated version. So we have the south pillar of the man, which represents the light, and that comes from this solar angel up in the heavens, in the midheaven, and this is what the midheaven represents in astrology. So let's examine this divine solar angel. Now, if you'll remember, Lucifer was one of the solar angels that descended to enlighten man, according to the Lucis Trust website, the UN Spiritual Foundation. So basically here, you are uniting man with a divine moment of gnosis coming from the solar angel by the woman looking back up at it. So the male, representing deity, is looking at the female, which represents earth, and earth represents man. And so this is where people can get caught up with sexes here. You think, oh, is that representing a woman? But this is an allegory for man, the nature of the earth. So the divine sinful man now has a moment or a spark of illumination, and he's now looking up to the heavens. So deity's looking down at earth, and earth is looking back up at him. And this is sort of an expression of the highest God, the union, the perfect union of androgyny. So you can see the motifs and how they're expressed. And this time, the fruit is up above Eve, and the serpent is the green serpent on the tree. So this is like the serpent in the Garden of Eden, man being freshly created from Jehovah. And now the serpent needs to enlighten him and say, hey, you know what? This isn't the highest God. He wants to trap you in the material realm. Let me illuminate you. And green is a color of Venus. And if you'll recall, the Lucis Trust website stated that Lucifer descended from the planet Venus to enlighten man. So you can see all of these things are connected. And obviously, a more orthodox tradition would view this as the lie of Lucifer, that you can be greater than your maker. Because basically that is Lucifer's essence in orthodoxy. He was created as the most beautiful, intelligent, charming, created being, but he got corrupted by his own pride and thought that he should be the highest. So he is trying to get you to rebel against God in the same exact way that he is. So that just kind of points out the dichotomy or the schism between these two viewpoints of Christianity. And when we get to the theology and cosmology video, we will explain how these two viewpoints can be expressed through the heliocentric globe model and the geocentric flat earth model. So we'll show why there is a theological conflict between these two models. We're not going to touch upon the scientific conflict. That's for all the other thousands of videos on YouTube to discuss. So anyways, slight digression there, but back to these two tarot cards. These are the extreme opposites, like Carl Jung talked about. Now, if we merge these two, profane man with deity, and the Lover's card, again, this is all metaphysical things. This isn't a physical depiction of anything. This is the spiritual consciousness that man can be endowed with. But we have a profane physical body, and so we have to evolve out of that so the body catches up to the spiritual consciousness. So it can be divine enough to have a perfect union with this spiritual host. That's the whole point. So this is why some people talk about transhumanism and what that really means. And that's not a conspiratorial thing. You can see all kinds of different talks on it. Like TED Talks has a lot of things about merging with technology to make human beings more advanced, stuff like that. You can get into that if you want, but just throwing that out there that it is a theme that connects to this. So let's summarize and wrap this up. From what Carl Jung said, the demiurge is Saturn, Yaldabaoth, Satan, Set, Yahweh, Jehovah, the devil, and the temperamental demiurgic Zeus. And this is duality, such as when Saturn conjuncts Jupiter. But this is still a good thing because it creates this conflict, and out of this conflict and being hit with this divine light will come a moment of illumination through chaos. So order out of chaos, chaos being the material world in the base consciousness modality. You can only sink so low before you will be able to come out of that. And then Jehovah, or whatever the demiurge is, being a lion, serpent, a donkey, any of these sort of animals, black being the primary color. And then we can see a little depiction here of this green lion attacking the sun. And this is a Gnostic alchemy sort of motif. And from what I understand about it, there is an exoteric and esoteric explanation and probably a lot of things in between. But on a more human, earthly level, this lion eats the sun, and that's kind of like an allegory for a person's consciousness or state of being in extreme darkness, and out of that darkness, they become very self-destructive, but that can lead to a moment of illumination. So to give an example of this using a movie, I just watched The Game recently, and basically Michael Douglas is this big-wig millionaire who is really only wrapped up in the material world, making money, and he's becoming kind of a douchebag. And he's about to have his birthday, and he's the same age that his father was when his father committed suicide because he was depressed. And what's interesting about that is that's sort of like the Saturn figure devouring his young, so like father, like son. And his dad was consumed by the material world, and so he became depressed and killed himself. And those are all attributes of Saturn. You know, devouring yourself, devouring your children, materialism, anxiety, fear, depression, Saturnine qualities, and of course, death. Then his brother signs him up for this quote-unquote game, which is a life-altering experience. And when he meets one of the guys who's gone through the game, he quotes the Bible. It's a verse from John, and John is huge in Gnosticism. And it's, where I once was blind, now I can see, something like that. But basically referring to the demiurge. The demiurge is the blind god, Samael, the blind one. And he's in ignorance or darkness, just like the devil card, right? The deepest point of darkness. And getting to that point can release a spark of divinity through sheer instinct and emotion. And so that's what happens in the movie. He's set up to go to this point where he thinks his bank accounts have been wiped out and he's left for dead in Mexico. And he symbolically comes out of the coffin of death in white clothing, and now his eyes are open. Things are different. And he's searching for spiritual things because he goes back and tries to find the people who did this. But he says he's not motivated by money. He doesn't care about having his money back. He says, I just want to see the wizard behind the curtain. So it's kind of like The Wizard of Oz, and that's a very occult movie. And Oz actually has to do with these two cards. And that gets into Aleister Crowley, the number 77. I don't want to get too advanced here, but basically, The Wizard of Oz is just this little shit, right? So it's this pathetic, ignorant essence, but it pretends it's all big and fearsome, like the lion. So anyways, back to the game. At the end, he realizes that he shoots his brother by accident, and he makes this self-sacrificing descent into matter to fall all the way down, and then he realizes everything's going to be okay. So you can see the Gnostic undertones in that movie, similar to Fight Club, where only when we've lost everything, we're free to do anything, like Tyler Durden says, and he's like burning himself with lye and doing all this crazy shit to get him to not care about material things, right? And if our fathers were our models for God, what does that say about God? Saying the demiurge, who is a paternal force, doesn't care about you, it's only egoic, therefore we must seek something different. So all of that has something to do with this lion concept, this destruction of the ego, and then birthing yourself anew, or on an esoteric level, eating philosophical gold, and then dissolving everything, and then from that, you bring out the true spiritual gold or nature of something. It's kind of convoluted. There's a lot going on with it. I don't really fully understand, but Isaac Newton wrote a ton about this, and we're going to go over a book that explains that, and it is definitely a scholarly book. Like I've said, we're trying to keep it to mainstream, credible sources to display this hidden religion throughout society. But now that we've explained the fundamental principles driving occult Gnosticism, alchemy, and all of these esoteric concepts through these highly decorated people such as Pagels and Jung, we now have the foundation to move forward and apply it to all of the physical sciences that we've come to know, and we will explain that in relation to the shape of the earth in the next video. So thank you, and we will see you there.